Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Automated Healthcare Reimbursement Guideline Series presented by Trisotech. My name is Jonathan, and I will be your host for this free series of 3 virtual micro events. Today, I'm joined by Dr. John Spiberly, CMIO of Trisotech, and Denis Gagné, CEO of Trisotech. In just a few minutes, they're going to present the first session, which is an orthopedic surgery pre-authorization use case. And 3 weeks from today, we will present a second use case, prior authorization for targeted drug therapy and streamlining the appeals of process examples in November. And in November, we will go about documentation of medical necessity for CMS home services. Before getting started, let's go over some logistics. First, this webinar is being recorded, and we will make the recording session as well as the slides available to all attendees. We will send you a link by email within 24 hours, and you will be able to register for the upcoming sessions as well. Second thing, this presentation will last around 20 minutes, so this will give us some time at the end to answer your questions. We already received some interesting questions, and you can still submit your own at any time during the presentation using the questions section of the GoToWebinar control panel. So now let's get started. I will be back for the Q&A, and Denis, you are free to begin.
Thank you, Jonathan. Good day, everybody. I'm Denis Gagné from Trisotech. The topic of this series of webinar is on healthcare reimbursement. Our goal here is really to give you a little bit of a glimpse of the art of the possible with automated guidelines for healthcare reimbursement. We're going to do that very quickly, so we're probably going to raise more questions than answers during this presentation. So healthcare reimbursement involves a series of processes to determine if a patient has insurance coverage for a specific healthcare service. The service without pre-authorization or medical necessity will probably not be accepted by the insurance company. So these processes have a very high impact on the patient and the provider. In using the term automatable guidelines in our context here, we refer to a single visual knowledge artifact that is both human readable and machine automatable. Our objective in using these automatable guidelines is to disambiguate traditional narrative guidelines that are often prone to many interpretation. In using the automation, we aim to offer the right knowledge at the right time during the flow of care. These automatable pre-authorization guidelines have many benefits to the various stakeholders, the payers, the patients, the providers. In particular here for the payers, they ensure that we get complete and correct information at submission, therefore increasing the decision throughput and allowing reallocation of resources. The solutions that are suggested here are based on a series of open standards. In particular, we're looking at 2 sets of open standards, one set promoted by the BPM Plus health community at the Object Management Group, and one set promoted by the HL7 standard group. So within the BPM Plus health community, the intent there, or the motivation, is to promote the usage of some very specific process modeling standards, namely BPMN, CMMN, and DMN. So these 3 standards, BPMN is the business process model and notation, CMMN is the case management model and notation, and DMN is the decision model and notation. These 3 standards allow you to capture visually the knowledge of how things should be and how things should happen. BPMN will provide you with more support around the notion of flow diagrams and guideline. CMMN will allow more ad hoc and personalized patient care, and DMN will provide you with decision and equation and decision table to come to particular conclusions. These 3 standards from OMG can all be used independently to create visual model of the knowledge, or they can be used in combination with one another. So you can have a model that is purely BPMN or purely CMMN or purely DMN, or you can have a BPMN model that uses a DMN model, etc., etc. And there are visual ways of capturing the knowledge. On the healthcare side, we're going to use two specific healthcare standards in this presentation today, namely FHIR, that is more about data sharing of the patient information, and another standard called CDS Hook that is aimed to integrate with various existing EHR and environment using, again, the FHIR-based standard. So to give you a very high level overview of how these standards are used and interact, you can see here that at the top I have an EHR system that has the CDS hook capability. In switching to a patient, this will start the processes, case, and decision of the BPM Plus model, which in turn will then go query the FHIR data of the particular patient. Using this information, we'll do the computation and recommendation and bring back what in the CDS world is called a CDS card back to the EHR. So hopefully this gives you a sense of the global context and the standards that we're using in what we're presenting today. I will now pass it to John, who will walk us through the specific use case of today, which is a total knee arthroplasty. So John?
Thank you, Denny. Thank you. Before we get started going into the specifics of the model, I'd like to state that BPMN and DMN are not really that familiar to many people in healthcare. However, they've been around for a long time. And as Denny says, they're open sourced and they represent standards that have been developed over many years. Two things that people are concerned about when going into a new technology is the technology going to grow as my needs grow? Second is, am I going to be locked in with a vendor? And these are concerns that impact how comfortable they are in dealing with someone. In both cases, the news is good because the technology is under constant development and being expanded and going into areas of machine learning and AI, as well as other areas. The second is because if a vendor builds their tools according to the standards, if you do not like that vendor anymore, you can export your models and go to a totally different vendor that adheres to the standards. And that gives you flexibility and control over your product. If you go to the next slide, please. When you look at pre-authorization, there are basically two scenarios that come up. One is the process where everything goes through in a straightforward fashion. The second is that there is a glitch in the approval process, and there may be some conflict between the insurance company, the provider, and the patient as to what is covered or not. The former is amenable to very clear processes and to automation. The second is more difficult to deal with, and that's going to be the topic of our next webinar, is how do you deal with the appeals process and the uncertainties that go into that scenario. If you go to the next slide, please. If we look at pre-authorization, this is usually done in advance of a procedure, and it is to establish medical necessity. If the procedure is not medically necessary, or if pre-authorization is not obtained, then the payer does not pay it for the procedure. And so this is of great concern to healthcare organizations. This is an example for a use case of the requirements for total knee arthroplasty. When you look at procedures on the knee, there are many type of such rules. Some deal with the very first surgery. Another does with a revision. There's partial arthroplasties. There's infected arthroplasties. There's many different types that might be covered by a company. This is difficult for many providers to keep track of if they deal with multiple companies, different types of insurance. This can be a real challenge. These guidelines are textual and basically requires the person to read and understand what is said. And as Denny said, these are sometimes open to various interpretations. This is something which, fortunately, the good part is that most of the rules are relatively straightforward and simple to understand. And it's a nice, insurance companies do a nice job in outlining the requirements. If we go to the next slide, if you look at a series of such statements of requirements, patterns start to appear, and these affect the process that pre-authorization goes through. On the left, we have a patient being presented for a review. There is a decision serving as a gatekeeper to decide, does this apply to the patient or not? If it applies, then the patient proceeds. If not, the patient exits. Next, there's a decision to say, does the patient meet the criteria, the medical necessity, the disease severity status required for the procedure to proceed? If yes, the person proceeds. If not, the person, again, exits. The third decision is have all alternative therapies that might be cheaper or less invasive or less have other adverse consequences, have they all been tried? If they've all been tried and failed, then you proceed to say it's okay to do this procedure. If not, again, you try the alternatives first. This whole sequence is a process that's modeled in BPMN. The yellow decisions are decisions, and they are modeled in DMN. And if we get the next slide, please. This outlines a model to do the textual description for the initial total knee arthroplasty. The little insert to the left shows the entire model. If we tried to show it on the slide, it'd be too hard to read, so we've taken out an excerpt. It requires around 30 data items to be inserted into the decisions, and then once started, it proceeds towards the to the final exit point. If we look at the larger diagram, the first decision is there a contraindication to the total knee procedure? Of course, if there's a contraindication, you don't want to do the procedure, and contraindications may be severe morbid obesity, an infection in the joint, an active infection someplace else. There's a series of 10 or 12 different criteria that would exclude a person from having surgery. Some are absolute, some are relative, where if they're corrected, then the person would be a candidate again. But until they're corrected, the person cannot have the surgery, so the person exits. The second one, which is marked with yellow, is a decision to decide, does this person meet the severity of disease and meet medical necessity? And so this decides, is this person having signs, symptoms, and complaints that justify the procedure? If the person doesn't have severe disease, it's only mild disease or intermittent, it's not very bothersome, then the person exits until at some point they do meet this criteria. If they do, then they go to the third decision, which is, has conservative therapy been tried and has it failed? Usually there's a time limit on the types of therapy that are stipulated, and usually it's around 6 months, maybe a little bit longer, but you usually try physical therapy, medication, or modified activities in the case of a total knee replacement. If they have gone through this sequence and have failed to gain an acceptable outcome, then they're approved for the total knee procedure. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see the DMN model that helps with the decision to decide, does this person have severe disease and meet the requirements of medical necessity? This is a relatively complex diagram, but the decision to decide if a knee joint is severe enough to be replaced is a complex decision. There are 5 sub-decisions. One relates to pain. A second relates to disability, which is a functional measurement. Then there's one for evidence, objective evidence on radiologic studies to show that there are changes consistent with severe disease. The fourth one describes the findings seen in the physical exam that are associated with a degenerated knee joint. And then finally, we have additional findings that relate to instability or physical findings that may also be found. This information is then comes from data input, which each of these sub-decisions are determined, then they're all fed into the final decision to say, is this severe disease or not? And if we go to the next slide, we can see a decision table which takes the various outputs from the 5 sub-decisions and basically gives you an answer, yes or no. Alternatively, there might be an equation, there might be a score, there may be any number of things that would be alternatives, but in this case, a decision table is used, which basically says if you look at the first line, if the disease is determined to be significant, if the pain is significant, and there are physical findings that are present, then the person meets the criteria. There's another rule that can be met, then the third and the fourth. If none of these trigger, then the person does not meet the criteria that the company, the payer has for the procedure to go forward. And that's basically an quick overview. To you, Denny.
Thank you, John. So what we'd like to do now is to give you a little bit of a demonstration of all this and be more concrete. We do realize that this is an awful lot to take at once, but we're really trying to raise more questions and show you the art of the possible. So back to the model. So you can see here, I have the BPMN model that John presented with the different steps. Connected to this model is a particular decision, which is the decision that John was talking about the severity, and then this goes through the process. So what we can do then, we can take this particular BPMN model, and as I mentioned before, a BPMN model can call other model, decision model, so that's the case here. It's calling 1, 2, 3 decisions, and it's providing 3 outputs at each decision, and based on these outputs, will lead us to a particular outcome. So we can publish this visual artifacts so that it is the code. So fundamentally, in the BPM plus health approach, you have a single knowledge artifact that is both the documentation and the code to execute. So when we publish this service here, we have different endpoints that are generated, so appealing more to the techie in the house. We have different endpoints, a form to use it, a REST API, Open API. And here I have basically a CDS hook endpoint that is generated on the fly from the model. So what we have here is a demo rig that we've created to showcase what's going on. And you can see here that I have a mock-up type of EHR environment, and this allows me to test various CDS hook. So right now I have the LO World CDS hook that is running, showing the LO patient. I'm now looking at rows. Now what I can do is I can go and take this endpoint here, copy it, and add it as a new service that is available into my environment. And as I do this, now suddenly this service becomes available, the CDS hook service, calls the automation model for that particular patient, use all the data of the patient and walk through. So here, for example, for Rose Reynolds, she has no contraindication. She meets the criteria for the diagnostic, and a conservative therapy has failed, so she's approved to the total knee arthroplasty. So looking at this, what we did is we took all the patient's data, we made all these decisions, and through this decision, we ended up in this end state, which is to approve the total knee arthroplasty. And now I can move from patient to patient. So if I move to, for example, from Rose to Michelle, then you see that for Michelle, she has no contraindication. She does meet the criteria, but the conservative therapy has not been exceeded. So we're recommending her back to continue or look at conservative therapy. And similarly, I can move to other patient and get their particular, for George, he has contraindication, so therefore we should reject him pending the resolution of this problem. So hopefully this gives you a little bit of a sense of what's possible, the art of the possible in capturing guidelines in a visual way that is both amicable to clinician and that is automatable and integratable into EMR and EHR in a very simple way. So our conclusions here is that for surgical pre-authorization, they can be automated with BPMN and DMN. This automation benefits the payers naturally, but also the patients and the provider greatly. And these models can be further integrated with other models for more preoperative assessments or other topics. So we want to keep our time short. So we're going to go right into questions. Again, the recording and the slides will be available to all attendees. So if you have some question, we invite you to put them in to the question slot so that Jonathan can bring them forward.
Yes, and we already have some questions. So the first one that I selected is one that we usually get. So I think it'll be a good starter and help you go over some of the things that you mentioned. So the question is from David, is the workflow something that runs externally to a system like an EHR, or is it embedded? And how do you go at making tests, changes, etc. in this particular setting?
Okay, so that's a few question loaded. So I'm going to take this one. So fundamentally, in this particular case, it's running externally. So what I've demoed here is that this is a hook service that is called, and then the answers are brought back. So it's running externally. But any EMR, EHR that will use those standards definition can read them in and automate it internally. So that's the whole idea of supporting open standards, is so that these definitions can be executed in various ways. So either be imported into a particular EHR for execution that support the standard, or hooked into the EHR on something that external. As for maintenance, then you have a full life cycle that you can have of enhancement and improvement to these models, and then they can be re-imported or redeployed as services. And as you deploy this new version of the service, then all the new instances are running the new version of the guideline. Hopefully I've addressed all your questions.
I think one thing that might be stated is that the design of these models is for people who are not programmers to be engaged in the development. These are designed for business people to develop models and to maintain and revise them.
Yep, perfect. Thank you for the answer. We have a second question here from Andrew asking, what does the process look like for a user in a clinical setting?
I'll let you answer, John, because on my side, Jonathan became choppy. I don't know if he became choppy for you too.
No, I mean, that's a good question, and it varies with how the model is used. There's many different types of models. One way of doing, there's no single answer to that. If you're running a model, usually it might be triggered by an order where the clinician might say, give me a risk profile on this patient, or get me informed consent, or get me something. The order is entered, and that creates the CDS hook. That's an outflow goes from the EHR to the outside service. The service executes if it has all the data, then it returns it back and embeds it into the EHR. Now you can put the services into the EHR, in which case it would run internally, but there's many different ways that it could be executed. You can have it execute automatically. You can also have it interactively, where if a user is sitting at a workstation and it has a problem and they're trying to troubleshoot a patient, then they can interactively exchange, put the data in as they go, not rely on an FHIR interface. Many different ways.
Perfect, thank you. Another question here, this one's from Deepak. He's asking, how can I use DMN when I need to pull patient data from an SQL database?
So I'll take this one, John. So DMN is independent of the knowledge or the data source. So your model, and that's the beauty of these standards, it allows you to create computationally independent models, so what we call platform independent models of the knowledge. And then what you do is you take the parameters or the inputs and the outputs parameters of these models and map them to the particular source that you're using. So in this case that we were showcasing, we were mapping to FHIR kind of data structure. In another context, you may be mapping through an SQL query, or you can do mapping to an Excel sheet or whatever your data source may be. And that's the benefit of this, is that your clinical knowledge or your process knowledge is independent of the data source.
Perfect, thank you. I was just trying to make sure I get the next question because it's pretty long. So this one is from Simone, asking that this one is directly for Dr. Zverli. In your experience, apart from improving insurance refund processes, do you see other sensible cost-saving factors as a consequence of introducing BPM plus automation in healthcare environment?
If you're talking about, I mean, healthcare is a pretty broad area. Mainly what this offers is, one, an ability to standardize so that people are saying the same thing, doing the same thing all in the same way. And that is something which healthcare doesn't have enough of. So one, it can improve standardization. It can also automate tasks that can be automated. Because there's a lot of stuff that's done in healthcare which is done manually, which doesn't need to be done manually. Every time something is done manually, there's always a 2 to 4% chance of an error being introduced, and that causes problems, especially when you're dealing with large numbers of activities. The third is that if you can get the ones that can be automated off your table, you have more time to address the problems that really need your input, and allows you to be focused. And I think the final part is that if you have processes that are automated and interface with the EHR, you get real-time information. One of the problems that happened in the past is you could fill out forms and you don't really know why the form is being done. You have no idea what the impact is going to be. You're just told to fill out a form, you fill out the form. When you can fill out the form and get immediate feedback that something is not right, then you get more engaged. It helps you do your job better.
And if I can add, if you're really looking at the financial aspect and the cost reduction, it comes from many different aspects. So John mentioned, the fact that things are done more efficiently and more effectively, doing the right thing at the right time. And then that free up a lot of time and allow some savings there. But there's also the factor that by doing these kind of approach, you will identify problems earlier. So rather than being reactive to everything, we can be proactive. And this proactivity, as we all know in the healthcare system, makes all the difference on the cost front, because a problem that is diagnosed or identified late tend to cost an awful lot more in terms of corrective and care than if it's identified early. So having these type of models that can be triggered early, that can be introspecting the patient to identify, can lead to a lot of very large cost saving in the healthcare system.
Perfect, thank you. So there are lots of questions regarding the software itself. I tried to pick one last because I know that we're running close to the end. That's more about the approach. So there's one question here from a clinician that says that they think that DMN is a very interesting way to author rules. Do we know if who would be the end users for DMN? Would they be clinicians, physicians, etc.? Who would be the main end users of this language?
So the target is clearly the subject matter expert. So we try to have a visual language that makes it amicable to subject matter expert. But I'll defer to John, who's really one of those subject matter experts and his experience of doing it.
Well, in theory, anyone can really use the models. The physician, the nurse, ancillary personnel, the patients. One of the questions is how is it being used? And that gets into, are you compliant with federal regulations? If you are dealing with models that are used by patients and a decision is being made and the other criteria are met, then it has to go through FDA regulations. If, on the other hand, the model is targeted to clinicians, the clinicians make the ultimate decision. There are no black box decisions being made. All the logic is clearly defined. Then, and it acts in certain ways where it's obvious that the clinician is making the decision. This is a supportive aspect to it. Then there are a lot of dispensations from the regulatory environment. But you can use it in all manner of ways. One is you can use it as a primary assistant in reaching a decision. You can use it as a second opinion. You can use it, I guess the main advantage is that if you're an expert in something, you often know most of the knowledge you need to have. But what if you're not an expert? Or what if the last time you took a course was 10 years ago? You have some knowledge, but not enough knowledge to act competently. Models can fit in that point to help you bridge the gap when you need to.
Perfect. So should we take one last question? I see that we're...
Okay, let's take one final question and we'll reply to the other question
Yes,
via emails.
exactly. That's what I was about to say. So one last question here. I think it's very interesting, especially for closing it off. How this approach supports interactive data entry by the provider into the decision flow? So for example, if the system is not able to determine a particular input, how is the data, could the data be manually entered?
So the end answer, and John addressed it just a minute ago in his answer, is that the answer is yes. If the information is not there, or the caretaker feels that the data that's coming from the automating data retrieval is not correct, they can overload and correct that data. So this becomes a matter of how this model is integrated into the environment. The logic remains the same, but we can integrate these models. I didn't showcase that here in the demo we did, but it's possible to do. And you can look at the various BPM Plus health recording that are available at the organization, and you'll see demonstration of such contexts where the data is modified. Again, it depends on the model you choose, as John mentioned. Either this is, there's two basic patterns. One pattern is that prior to making the decision, you make the clinician confirm all the data, and then you make the decision. Or you can have the decision be made from the data, and then the clinician approve or disapprove or confirm or unconfirm the results of the decision. So there are many ways of setting this into the deployment. It's an integration and deployment choice.
And also one issue is, what the inputs are going to be that you need. If you go to the EHR and the information is not available, and it's not something that is you see at the bedside or already, such as a laboratory test or an X-ray, you can know in advance before execution that knowledge is deficient. If you have it set up properly, then you can automate the ordering of tests so the missing information can be collected and then let you know that it's time to do it. So it basically saves a lot of the cognitive load that's on a clinician.
Perfect. Well, thank you for your time, Denis and John. And to those who sent questions that we did not address, Don, Jim, Catherine, we will make sure to follow up with you by email. Once again, I will send a link to the recording and the slides of this presentation, and we will open registrations for the upcoming session as well. So until next time, thank you very much for your time, guys.
Thank you, Jonathan.